Hello, Santa Cruz Police Department.
Malone speaking. I'm all finished now.
Hello?
Anybody there?
One day there would be a body part found somewhere or washing in from the ocean.
The elusive killer was right under the noses of the cops that pursued him.
He had a great personality. He was a likable guy.
He would have oral sex with a decapitated head.
His mother would lock him in the basement room at night because she had this idea that he could possibly sexually assault his sisters.
That was a very harmful place for him to be institutionalized. He certainly learned a lot of bad things.
We had 1,600 patients in the hospital. There were probably several dozen people who had committed murder. 800 mentally disordered sex offenders. We had psychology staff of only 10 people or so. Ed is a bright fellow. And that was obvious when you were talking with him. He was kind of a model patient.
My younger sister's 2 years younger, and I developed some morbid games. My life had started going that way at about 8. At a certain time of the evening, the family left the center room, the living room of the house. My mother and my sisters, or my sisters themselves, would go up to bed upstairs, where I used to go to bed upstairs. I had to go down to the basement. And an 8-year-old child had a tough time differentiating the reason in that. Why am I going to the basement? I'm going to hell, they're going to heaven.
Imagine calling the police to confess and they hang up on you. Not once, but multiple times. Because they know you. Because you're their friend. Because you've been sitting in their favorite bar, buying them drinks, chatting about their cases, learning everything about how they hunt criminals. And now you're trying to tell them you've ended the lives of 10 people, including your own mother. This is exactly what happened on April 23rd, 1973, in Pueblo, Colorado. A 6'9" man with an IQ of 145 stood in a phone booth, desperately trying to convince police officers who considered him a buddy that he was one of the most dangerous offenders California had ever seen. Between May 1972 and April 1973, young women began disappearing from the roads around Santa Cruz, California. College students, hitchhikers, someone's daughter, someone's sister. They would leave campus or a friend's house, thumb out, trusting that the next car would get them safely to their destination. But for 6 of them, that car was driven by a friendly, intelligent young man who seemed safe, who had a university parking sticker, who talked about psychology and seemed educated, who smiled warmly and offered helpful conversation. Within hours, they were gone. The remains told a horrifying story. These weren't crimes of passion or rage. These were calculated, methodical acts carried out by someone who understood human psychology, who knew exactly how to appear trustworthy, who had studied law enforcement techniques, and who was getting better with each victim. He kept souvenirs. He revisited scenes. He documented everything in his mind with photographic precision. And perhaps most chilling of all, he was hiding in plain sight, fooling everyone who knew him, including the very detectives hunting for the person responsible. How does a 15-year-old commit his first violent crimes and then walk free to harm again? What creates a mind so methodical that it can separate human beings into parts while maintaining a friendly conversation with police? How does someone attend college classes while actively committing crimes, appearing completely normal to everyone around them? And the question that still echoes today, could this have been prevented? Edmund Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California, into what appeared from the outside to be a typical middle-class American family. His father, Edmund Jr., worked as an electrician, providing a stable income. His mother, Clarnell, was a strong-willed woman with definite ideas about how things should be done. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and Edmund, their only son. But inside the Kemper household, a different reality was taking shape, one that would have devastating consequences not just for this family, but for numerous innocent people in the years to come. The marriage between Edmund Jr. and Clarnell was volatile from the start. They fought frequently, their arguments often centering on how to raise their children, particularly their son. Clarnell was domineering and critical, often belittling young Edmund, mocking his size as he began growing unusually tall at an early age, and according to later accounts from Edmund himself and others who knew the family, creating an environment of constant criticism and emotional turmoil. Nothing Edmund did was ever good enough for his mother. Every achievement was minimized, every failure magnified and thrown back in his face. When Edmund was just 9 years old, his parents divorced. A traumatic event for any child, but particularly difficult given the circumstances. He moved with his mother and 2 sisters to Montana, leaving behind his father and the only home he'd ever known. The divorce, rather than bringing peace, intensified the family dysfunction that had been building for years. In Montana, things went from bad to worse. Clarnell, now a single mother raising 3 children, became increasingly fearful of her son. As Edmund grew taller and larger, she began to see him as a threat. She made a decision that would haunt Edmund for the rest of his life. She forced him to sleep in the basement, locked away from his sisters. She allegedly told him that his sisters needed to be protected from him, that there was something wrong with him, that he couldn't be trusted around them. For a young boy already struggling with feelings of isolation and rejection from his mother, already dealing with the trauma of his parents' divorce, this additional rejection became deeply embedded in his psyche. Night after night, Edmund would be sent down to the cold basement, the door locked from the outside. He would lie there in the darkness, listening to his mother and sisters living their lives upstairs, feeling utterly alone and abandoned. The basement became both his prison and his refuge, a place where his dark thoughts could grow unchecked, where fantasies could develop without interference. The impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. Child psychologists now understand that prolonged isolation and rejection during critical developmental years can have severe psychological consequences. Edmund was experiencing not just physical isolation, but emotional abandonment by the very person who was supposed to love and protect him unconditionally. By his early teenage years, Edmund's thoughts had turned increasingly disturbing. The warning signs were clear to anyone who cared to look, though tragically, no one did. He began playing strange games with his sisters, games where he pretended to be executed in a gas chamber, acting out his own demise in disturbing detail. His sisters thought it was just weird behavior from their odd brother, not recognizing it as the cry for help it actually was. He cut the heads off his sisters' dolls, methodically removing them and keeping them separate from the bodies. When questioned about this behavior, he couldn't explain why he did it, only that he felt compelled to do so. The symbolism, obvious in hindsight, went completely unnoticed at the time. Then came the incident with the family cat. Edmund buried the family cat alive in the backyard, an act of cruelty that shocked even his often absent mother. But he didn't stop there. Later, he dug up the cat's remains, removed its head, and mounted it on a stick, keeping it as some kind of trophy. When his mother discovered what he'd done, she was horrified and disgusted. But rather than getting Edmund serious psychological help, she simply punished him and tried to move on. Edmund later admitted in interviews that even at this young age, he had violent fantasies that involved harming others, particularly women. He fantasized about having power over people, about controlling them, about making them do what he wanted. These weren't normal childhood thoughts or typical teenage rebellion. These were the early warning signs of a deeply disturbed mind developing along a dangerous path. At 13, unable to cope with life with his mother any longer, Edmund ran away. He traveled to California to find his father, hoping that Edmund Jr. would take him in, would provide the male guidance and acceptance he so desperately craved. But Edmund Jr., who had remarried and was starting fresh with a new wife and a new life, didn't want his troubled son disrupting things. The rejection by his father, the one person Edmund had hoped would save him from his mother, was perhaps even more devastating than his mother's treatment. Edmund Jr. refused to let his son stay, and instead sent Edmund to live with his own parents, Edmund's paternal grandparents, Maud and Edmund Sr., on their remote ranch in North Fork, California. The ranch in North Fork was isolated, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by wilderness. For most teenagers, this might have been an adventure, a chance to learn about ranch life and enjoy the outdoors. For Edmund, already troubled and now feeling rejected by both parents, it became another form of imprisonment. His grandmother Maud was a stern woman who ran the household with strict rules and high expectations. She had little patience for Edmund's moody behavior and adolescent difficulties. His grandfather, Edmund Sr., was a distant figure who spent most of his time working on the ranch, leaving discipline and daily interaction to his wife. Edmund felt increasingly isolated and angry. He had no friends his age, no social outlets, no one to talk to about the dark thoughts that consumed him. He spent hours alone, walking the property, thinking, planning, fantasizing. The ranch had firearms, necessary tools for rural life, and Edmund became familiar with them, learning to shoot, learning to handle weapons with increasing confidence. The isolation gave him time to think, but it also gave his darkest thoughts room to grow unchecked. He felt trapped, unwanted by his parents, controlled by his grandmother, ignored by his grandfather. The anger and resentment built day by day, week by week, until it felt like a pressure that had to be released somehow. On this late summer day, 15-year-old Edmund was at the ranch with his grandparents. His grandfather had plans to go into town for groceries, a routine trip that usually took a couple of hours. Edmund would be left alone with his grandmother, something that had happened many times before without incident. But on this day, something was different. An argument erupted between Edmund and Maud at the kitchen table. The exact trigger for the argument has been disputed over the years. Edmund later claimed his grandmother was nagging him about his chores, criticizing him the way his mother always had, and something inside him simply snapped. He went to where the rifles were kept and retrieved a .22 caliber rifle. He returned to the kitchen where his grandmother was still sitting at the table. Without warning, without giving her a chance to defend herself or even understand what was happening, Edmund ended her life, shooting her in the head and back. Maud Kemper, a woman who had taken in her troubled grandson trying to help him, died in her own kitchen at his hands. But Edmund's actions that day weren't finished. He knew his grandfather would return soon from the grocery store. He could have run, could have called for help, could have done anything else. Instead, he made a calculated decision. He waited. When he heard his grandfather's car approaching, Edmund went outside and met him in the driveway. As Edmund Sr. got out of the car, probably ready to greet his grandson and ask him to help bring in the groceries. Edmund ended his life as well. 2 people who had tried to help him, who had taken him in when his own parents wouldn't, were now gone. Then Edmund did something that would become a pattern in his later crimes. He called for help. He didn't run or try to hide what he'd done. Instead, he phoned his mother in Montana and told her what had happened. Clarnell, despite her complicated relationship with her son, told him to call the police immediately. When officers arrived at the remote ranch, they found Edmund waiting calmly. He explained what he'd done in a matter-of-fact tone that disturbed the responding officers. When asked why he had ended his grandparents' lives, his response was chilling in its honesty. "I just wondered how it would feel to take someone's life." Later, he would add that he had taken his grandmother's life because he was angry at her, and his grandfather's life because he knew the older man would be upset about his wife. Edmund was arrested and charged as a juvenile. Given the severity of the crimes and his age, he was sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for mentally ill offenders. Psychiatrists who examined him diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, a serious mental illness that, in their assessment, required long-term treatment and confinement. At Atascadero, Edmund was supposed to receive treatment and remain until he was deemed safe for release. But here's what should concern everyone about this case. Edmund was brilliant. With an IQ measured at 145, placing him in the genius range, he was smarter than most of his doctors, smarter than most of the staff, and he quickly learned how to use that intelligence to manipulate the system designed to contain him. He studied psychology voraciously, reading every book he could get his hands on. He memorized the psychological tests that psychiatrists would give him, learning the right answers that would indicate rehabilitation and mental health improvement. He learned exactly what to say, how to act, what emotions to display to convince evaluators that he was making progress. More disturbingly, he was actually allowed to help administer psychological tests to other patients. This gave him insider knowledge of how the tests worked, what responses indicated what diagnoses, and how to game the entire system. It was like teaching a bank robber how the vault worked, and then expecting him not to use that knowledge. Edmund was charismatic and intelligent, and he befriended staff members, making himself useful, becoming a model patient. Staff began to see him as helpful, cooperative, even likable. The monster who had ended 2 lives at age 15 gradually became, in their eyes, a rehabilitated young man who had made a terrible mistake but learned from it. Some psychiatrists, particularly those who had worked with Edmund longest and knew his case best, objected to his release. They argued that he remained dangerous, that his cooperation was manipulation rather than genuine change, that releasing him would be a tragic mistake, but their objections were overruled. In 1969, at age 21, after serving just 5 years for ending the lives of 2 people, Edmund Emil Kemper III was released on parole. The system that was supposed to protect society from dangerous individuals had failed its first major test. Despite the strong objections from psychiatrists who knew him best, despite his history of violence, despite every warning sign, Edmund was released on parole. And in a decision that defies all logic and understanding, he was sent to live with the one person who had contributed most to his psychological problems, his mother, Clarnell. Clarnell was now living in Santa Cruz, California, working as an administrative assistant at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The university was growing rapidly, attracting students from across California and beyond, creating a vibrant campus community. Young people, particularly young women, were everywhere in Santa Cruz, hitchhiking between campus and town, trusting in the general safety of their college community. The same toxic relationship between Edmund and his mother resumed immediately. She criticized him constantly, belittled his attempts to find work and build a life, reminded him of his failures and his time at Atascadero. The humiliation and rage he'd felt as a child came flooding back. But now, he was a full-grown man, standing 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds. Edmund desperately wanted to become a highway patrol officer. He'd been fascinated by law enforcement since childhood, studied police procedures extensively, and believed he could be good at the work. But his dreams crashed against reality. At his height and weight, he exceeded the physical requirements for the California Highway Patrol. They rejected his application, and this rejection stung deeply. Here was a young man who had studied law enforcement, who knew police procedures better than many officers, who desperately wanted to be part of that world, and he was being told he didn't measure up because he was too tall. The rejection felt like yet another person telling him he wasn't good enough, wasn't acceptable, didn't fit in. Infiltrating the police world, 1970 to 1972. But Edmund found another way into the world of law enforcement. He began frequenting a bar called the Jury Room, a popular hangout for local police officers and sheriff's deputies. His size made him memorable. His intelligence made him interesting, and his genuine interest in police work made him popular with the law enforcement crowd. Officers began to know him by name. They'd save him a seat at the bar. They'd include him in their conversations about cases they were working on, techniques they were using, challenges they were facing. Edmund would buy rounds of drinks, ask thoughtful questions, offer insights drawn from his extensive reading about criminology and police procedure. What these officers didn't know, couldn't possibly have known given that his juvenile records were sealed, was that they were befriending someone who had already ended 2 lives. They were sharing investigation techniques with someone who would use that knowledge to avoid detection. They were, unknowingly, training the very person who would soon become one of California's most dangerous offenders. Edmund absorbed everything. He learned about forensic evidence and how police collected it. He learned about investigation procedures and common mistakes criminals made. He learned about what made cases difficult to solve and what helped solve them quickly. Every piece of information was filed away in his exceptional memory, ready to be used when the time came. In 1972, Edmund took several significant steps toward preparing for what was to come. He purchased a motorcycle, which he rode extensively around the Santa Cruz area. This allowed him to familiarize himself with remote roads, isolated areas, places where someone could go unseen and unheard. The motorcycle was later involved in an accident that, while injurious to Edmund, entitled him to a $15,000 insurance settlement. This was a substantial amount of money in 1972, equivalent to roughly $100,000 today. Edmund used this money to purchase a car that would become infamous in the annals of true crime. A tan 1969 Ford Galaxy. But this wasn't just any car purchase. Edmund modified the vehicle to suit his purposes. He installed a secondary lock on the passenger side that could only be opened from the outside, effectively trapping anyone who sat in that seat. He kept weapons in the vehicle, hidden but readily accessible. He made sure the car was clean, presentable, trustworthy looking. Around the same time, Edmund successfully petitioned to have his juvenile record sealed. This meant that his history at Atascadero, his diagnoses, his violent past, all of it disappeared from official view. Anyone doing a background check would see a clean record. He also passed a psychiatric evaluation, with evaluators declaring him no longer a threat. Officially, on paper, Edmund Emil Kemper III was a normal young man with no criminal history, no mental health concerns, no reason for anyone to be wary of him. In reality, he was a carefully preparing predator who was about to embark on a crime spree that would terrorize an entire community. Edmund also began taking classes at a local community college, studying subjects that interested him and further establishing his cover as a normal young man trying to better himself. He worked odd jobs, maintained a regular routine, and appeared to everyone who knew him as a somewhat awkward but harmless young man still living with his mother and trying to find his way in life. But in private, Edmund was studying. He was watching. He paid attention to the young women who hitchhiked around the university area. He noted their patterns, their routines, the times when they were most likely to be looking for rides. He studied their psychology, understanding that they would be more likely to trust someone who appeared educated, who had a university parking sticker, who talked about familiar topics. He was methodical in his planning. This wasn't a crime of passion or impulse that he was preparing for. This was calculated, patient, carefully thought out. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He just needed to wait for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right victim. On this spring day, the kind of perfect California afternoon that makes people believe the world is a safe and beautiful place, two 18-year-old friends from Fresno State College, Marianne Pesce and Anita Lucchesa, were hitchhiking from Berkeley back to Fresno. They'd been visiting friends in the Bay Area and needed to get home. Hitchhiking was common, almost expected among college students in 1972. It was economical, it was an adventure, and in the general culture of the early 1970s, it seemed safe enough. Edmund picked them up on the highway in his Ford Galaxy. To Marianne and Anita, he seemed like the perfect ride. He was going their direction. He was clean-cut and presentable. He spoke intelligently about college life and seemed safe, even friendly. They got into the car without hesitation, probably feeling lucky to have found such a good ride so quickly. Edmund drove them away from the highway, telling them he knew a shortcut or needed to make a quick stop. The young women, trusting and unsuspecting, didn't object. He drove them to a remote, isolated area where no one would see, no one would hear, no one would interrupt what he had planned. What happened next demonstrated the calculated, methodical nature of Edmund's crimes. This wasn't a sudden act of violence or a crime of opportunity that got out of control. Edmund had planned this, prepared for it, thought through every step. He ended the lives of both young women in that remote location. But he didn't stop there. Edmund drove their bodies back to his apartment in Alameda, where he was living separately from his mother at the time. He waited until he knew he would be alone, then brought the victims inside. What he did to their remains over the following hours showed his complete lack of humanity, his total objectification of his victims as things rather than people. He kept pieces of the victims as souvenirs, trophies of his crimes. Later, he methodically disposed of their remains in remote locations in the Santa Cruz mountains, scattering parts in different areas to make discovery and identification more difficult. The bodies weren't discovered for months, and when they were finally found, the condition of the remains made identification extremely challenging. Marianne's and Anita's families waited for their daughters to come home, not knowing that they would never walk through the door again. Missing person reports were filed, Friends searched, flyers were posted. But months passed without answers, without closure, without justice. 4 months after Marianne and Anita disappeared, Edmund was ready to act again. On September 14th, he picked up 15-year-old Aiko Ku, a talented dancer who was hitchhiking to a dance class in San Francisco. Aiko was a bright, promising young girl with her whole life ahead of her, passionate about dance and excited about her future. Edmund picked her up near Highway 1, offering her a ride in his presentable Ford Galaxy. Once again, he seemed safe. He was older, seemed responsible, and was going her direction. Aiko, like so many others, had no reason to suspect danger. Edmund drove her to a remote area, holding her captive before ending her life. The details of what he did during this time show a pattern that was developing. He was taking more time with his victims, becoming more confident in his ability to avoid detection, more brazen in his actions. Once again, he brought the body back to his apartment while his mother was away at work. He committed further horrible acts before methodically disposing of Aiko's remains in the mountains. Her body was found in pieces months later, discovered by hikers in a remote area. The investigation was complicated by the remote location, the condition of the remains, and the length of time that had passed since her disappearance. Aiko's family was devastated. Their talented, beautiful daughter was gone, taken by violence they couldn't comprehend. The dance community mourned a promising young artist. But still, no one connected these crimes. The pattern wasn't yet clear to investigators. By January 1973, Edmund had moved back in with his mother in Aptos, a decision that increased his rage and his need to act out violently. Clarnell was working at UC Santa Cruz, and their home was near the campus, surrounded by potential victims. On January 8th, Edmund picked up Cindy Shaw, a student at Cabrillo College. Cindy was bright, friendly, and trusting, like so many young women of her generation, who had grown up believing in the general goodness of people. Edmund took her to a quiet area in Santa Cruz and ended her life. This time, displaying the escalating boldness that often characterizes such offenders, he brought her body back to his mother's house in Aptos. While his mother was home, sleeping in her bedroom, Edmund stored parts of Cindy's remains in his bedroom closet. He lived with this horrific secret in his closet for days, his mother completely unaware of what was mere feet from where she slept. Later, he removed the remains piece by piece, disposing of them in various locations. Cindy's remains were discovered in February 1973 near Highway 1, and this discovery finally began to make investigators realize they might have a serious problem. Just weeks after Cindy's remains were discovered, Edmund struck again. On February 5th, 1973, he picked up 2 more victims, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, both students at UC Santa Cruz. The young women were hitchhiking off campus when Edmund's familiar Ford Galaxy pulled up. By this point, warnings had started to circulate around campus about hitchhiking safety, but many students still felt that taking rides was necessary for getting around. Public transportation was limited, cars were expensive, and hitchhiking had been safe for so long that it was hard to believe it had suddenly become dangerous. Rosalind and Alice got into Edmund's car, probably chatting with him about campus life, classes, their plans for the day. Edmund seemed like someone who belonged in their world, someone connected to the university community. He drove them to a quiet location and ended both of their lives quickly and efficiently. Their bodies were later found in Eden Canyon, and this discovery finally made it crystal clear to law enforcement. Santa Cruz had a serial offender operating in their community, someone who was specifically targeting young women, particularly college students. The pattern was undeniable now. Someone was hunting the young women of Santa Cruz. By early 1973, the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office had recovered remains from multiple victims. The pattern was clear. Young women, often students, often hitchhikers, disappearing from similar locations. The community was terrified. Parents forbade daughters from hitchhiking. The university issued warnings. But the person responsible remained unidentified. What investigators didn't know was that he was closer than they imagined. Edmund Kemper was sitting in the jury room, listening to detectives discuss the very crimes he'd committed. He learned what evidence they had, what leads they were following, what mistakes they thought the offender was making. This gave him an incredible advantage. He knew exactly how much danger he was in, which at that point was very little. Nobody suspected the friendly giant who bought rounds of drinks and asked thoughtful questions about police work. On Good Friday, Edmund's rage toward his mother reached its breaking point. In the early morning hours, while she slept, he entered her room with a hammer and ended her life. He then committed further acts of desecration that reveal the depth of his hatred. But he wasn't finished. Later that day, Edmund called his mother's friend, Sally Hallett, inviting her to the house for a surprise dinner for his mother. When Sally arrived, Edmund ended her life as well. He then took his mother's car and drove east, eventually reaching Colorado. For 3 days, he waited for news reports, expecting a massive manhunt. But nobody had discovered the bodies. Nobody was looking for him. In Pueblo, Colorado, Edmund decided he was tired of waiting. He called the Santa Cruz Police Department from a payphone and told them he'd harmed several people, including his mother. The officers who answered knew Edmund. They thought it was a bad joke. They hung up. He called back. Again, they didn't believe him. This friendly guy from the bar? The one who asked about police work? No way. Edmund called multiple times, finally convincing them to at least check his mother's house. When officers entered the residence, they found the horrifying scene. Edmund had been telling the truth. He was arrested in Colorado and extradited back to California. During interrogations, he confessed to all 10 cases, providing details that only the person responsible could know. He gave locations of remains. He explained his methods. He talked for hours, seemingly relieved to finally share what he'd done. Edmund was charged with 8 counts relating to the deaths. His trial began in late 1973. His defense argued insanity, pointing to his history at Atascadero and his diagnoses. But prosecutors presented evidence of extreme premeditation and planning. They showed how Edmund had prepared his car, studied police procedures, hidden his crimes, and maintained a completely normal appearance. The jury heard recordings of his confessions, delivered in a calm, matter-of-fact tone that chilled everyone in the courtroom. After deliberating, the jury found Edmund guilty on all counts. He was found to be sane during the commission of his crimes. California had recently reinstated the death penalty, and Edmund expected that sentence. During the sentencing phase, the judge asked Edmund what he thought his punishment should be. His response was telling: elimination by any means possible. However, the death penalty ruling was later overturned on technical grounds. Instead, Edmund received 8 concurrent life sentences. Edmund was sent to California Medical Facility in Vacaville, later transferred to California State Prison Folsom. Over the decades, he has become one of the most cooperative subjects for criminal psychology research. He's given extensive interviews, helping researchers understand the psychology behind such crimes. He's expressed remorse, though whether it's genuine remains debated. He's assisted in training FBI profilers at Quantico. Edmund has been eligible for parole multiple times, but has never been granted release. He has reportedly waived his right to parole hearings, stating he doesn't deserve to be free. As of the last reports, he remains incarcerated, now in his 70s. It's crucial to remember that behind these crimes were real people with real lives. Maud and Edmund Kemper Sr., grandparents trying to help their troubled grandson. Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, 18-year-old friends, college students with futures ahead of them. Aiko Ku, 15-year-old girl on her way to dance class. Cindy Schall, college student pursuing her education. Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, friends, students, young women full of potential. Clarnell Strandberg, a mother with a complicated relationship with her son, but still a human being. Sally Hallett, a friend who walked into a nightmare. Each of these individuals had families who loved them, friends who missed them, and lives that were stolen. Edmund Kemper's case reveals multiple systemic failures. A 15-year-old who ended 2 lives was released after just 5 years, despite objections from mental health professionals. His juvenile records were sealed, hiding his dangerous history. He was placed with the very person, his mother, who triggered much of his rage. Mental health facilities need better protocols for assessing genuine rehabilitation versus learned responses. The criminal justice system must better track individuals with violent histories. Parole decisions should weight professional psychological assessments more heavily. Edmund displayed warning signs throughout his youth: harming animals, violent fantasies, social isolation, and deep resentment toward his mother. While not every troubled child becomes dangerous, these red flags should trigger intervention and support. Early mental health intervention matters. Family dynamics that involve abuse, ridicule, or isolation can have severe consequences. Creating safe channels for troubled youth to receive help could prevent future tragedies. The victims in this case often made a choice common in the 1970s: hitchhiking. While we can't blame victims for being targeted, we can learn from how predators operate. They appear normal, friendly, safe. They exploit trust. Teaching awareness without victim blaming means understanding that danger doesn't always look dangerous. Trust your instincts. Share your plans. Understand that intelligence and charm can mask harmful intentions. Edmund Kemper's crimes contributed to significant changes in how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases, particularly when patterns emerge. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit studied his case extensively, improving criminal profiling techniques that help identify and catch offenders more quickly today. His cooperation with researchers, while disturbing to consider, has genuinely helped develop better understanding of criminal psychology, potentially preventing future crimes through improved detection and intervention. The story of Edmund Kemper reminds us that awareness and early intervention can save lives. If you found this documentary informative, please share it to spread awareness about the warning signs and systemic improvements we still need. Subscribe to stay informed about true crime cases and the lessons they teach us. Together, we can work toward a future where such tragedies are prevented through education, better mental health support, and community vigilance.